Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 87 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we're going to be listening to the first of two parts on the Battle of Jutland, which is the World War I kind of decisive, or maybe not so decisive as we'll learn, but definitely very large naval battle in the North Sea between the British and German naval forces. This first part is going to cover some of the background and really kind of talk about, how naval warfare was changing from kind of the late 19th century into really kind of what is becoming kind of more the modern age of battleships and, of course, dreadnoughts. And we'll cover, what makes a ship a dreadnought in this. And then we'll kind of end with the battle actions itself before going on to part two. So let's go ahead and get into the episode then.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing the World War I naval battle, the Battle of Jutland, which was a large dreadnought-driven battle. And our guest today, the fourth man in the boat, as the user is known on the Ask Historians forum, will be able to tell us all about that. But before we do, let me turn to our guest and just ask them, what got you interested in this subject?
So it's family history, really. My grandfather flew airplanes with the Royal Navy in the Second World War, and researching that really got me interested in it. That and games, sort of war games like War in the Pacific and so on. I'll play these games and then read to get the history around them. And just got really interested in the whole topic through that. I'm not a historian myself, I'm an astronomer, but it's a really interesting topic. And it's First World War in particular, for the Royal Navy, is a really fascinating time. It's a time when they're going through a technical revolution. You're seeing things moving from the days of reciprocating steam engines and gunpowder-filled shells to high explosives and airplanes and dreadnoughts. And all these things are changing at the same time as there's this massive tactical revolution, where the innovation of radio, the innovation of ships that go much faster than the podding steamships of the 1800s, torpedoes, all these things mean that commanders have to deal with so much more than they've had to in the past, and they're exerting more tactical control, and they're doing it in different ways, and there's just so much there interlocking, interplaying, that makes the period really fascinating.
So Jutland, I think, may be most famous for being this naval battle between these very large battleships, these dreadnoughts, as we've mentioned, and almost kind of seemingly unique in that sense, it seems like to me when I was doing my background research. Is that kind of true? I guess the question here would be, what was kind of the state of naval warfare before Jutland? And I guess the follow-up question here is, what makes this class of ships that we call dreadnoughts so unique?
So I'll start off with the preceding big naval battle to Jutland, which is Tsushima in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So what happens there is the Russians and the Japanese are fighting a war, not really something I know much about, but the Russian Pacific Fleet has been completely destroyed by the Japanese fleet, and also by things like artillery bombardments, their main port and so on. But so the Russians sail their Baltic fleet all the way round from St. Petersburg to Japan. Along the way, they get into all sorts of hilarious mishaps. They open fire on a bunch of British fishing ships in the North Sea, believing they're German torpedo boats, that sort of thing. So they get to the Straits of Tsushima, which are between Japan and Korea. And there, the Japanese engage them and completely destroy their fleet for very little loss. This really puts to the test the ships of the generation in 1905, almost. The ships and the naval theories and the tactics that are being used at this time. And so the ships that are currently being used at this time, the battleships, they have two big gun turrets, usually about 10 to 12 inches. And then they have a whole bunch of smaller ones, because they're designed to fight at a battle at close range. And the big guns take a long time to load, and so having the smaller ones is really advantageous because they fire faster, that you can put a lot more shells into a target. But observers at Tsushima are going, you know what, these small guns aren't really doing much. There's a quote from a British observer there, which is something like, for all the clamour of the 12-inch shells, the 10-inch and 10-inch shells go unnoticed, and the 6-inch and 8-inch shells might as well be pedestrians on the streets of London. That's a really bad paraphrasing of the quote, but everyone's going, we need to be putting big guns on this battleship. This isn't really on battleships. This isn't really a new idea. An Italian designer called Cuniberti had come up with this idea in 1903, had proposed a ship with an armament of all big guns. In Britain, Japan, the US, people start really designing these ships. So the US starts, Japan starts first, I think. They have a design that's going to use all 12-inch guns, but they don't have enough money to buy all the 12-inch guns they need. So it ends up getting armed with 2 12-inch turrets and the rest with 10-inch guns. So it's not quite an all-big-gun battleship, but the intent is there. The Americans start building their ones, the South Carolina class, before the British do. But the British get there first, because of a guy called Jackie Fisher. Fisher is probably the most important person in the history of the Royal Navy in the late 1800s, 1900s, 1910s. He is there transforming everything. He has a lot of opinions on how battleships should work, how battles should be fought. And he comes up with design, he and Britain's naval design staff come up with the idea for the ship that's going to be Dreadnought. And this has 3 main things. It's got all big gun armament, which means that it can fire, it can outrange any ship preceding it. It's got 8-gun broadside, thereabouts. 8-gun broadside, which can fire out to ranges longer than any of the preceding battleships. It's got turbine engines rather than reciprocating engines. So reciprocating engines are slow and unreliable and not very powerful. Turbine engines, completely reliable. So if you run a reciprocating engine at full speed, things start to break in about a day. While Dreadnought was able to run with her turbine engines at a speed of about 17 knots, which is sort of top speed for a battleship with reciprocating engines, all the way to the Caribbean without a mechanical failure on her first cruise. So then he also puts quite a lot of work into making her survivable, making sure that there are very few ways for flooding and so on to get water to get into the ship to sink it. And if water does make it into the ship, there's enough subdivision there to at least try and keep her afloat for as long as possible. Fisher has been working on getting the Royal Dockyards at Portsmouth and Rosyth and around the UK as spick and span as possible so they can build ships like this really quickly. Dreadnought gets churned out in about a year. She's launched in 1906 and almost immediately wipes the slate clean in terms of battleships. The RN, the Royal Navy, is at least in theory, aiming for what's called a 2-power standard, where it had a strong enough fleet to destroy fleets of the next 2 biggest naval powers. Dreadnought pretty much outclassed every ship in that fleet right out the gate in 1906. And so that's what makes her important.
So do we see with the introduction of dreadnoughts and kind of this, I guess you say this emphasis on bigger guns and kind of de-emphasizing the smaller guns? I mean, are we seeing kind of a shift in the tactics and kind of, I guess, just the understanding of naval warfare at this time?
Yeah, almost, but it's more a sort of the 1800s, late 1800s are a bunch of people going, we have no clue how to sink a ship. Does ramming work? We don't know. It seemed to work at the end of in the Austro-Prussian War. It seemed to work in the American Civil War. Maybe let's stick rams on things. So pretty much all British pre-dreadnought battleships have at least some concession towards a ram. It's not a very big one, but they have ram bows, which are at least capable of penetrating armor. People start thinking, we have no way of controlling guns out to a long range, so we need to be getting close to them. And getting close to them means let's put lots of small, fast-firing guns on them, or at least, faster-firing, smaller guns on them. And that's because in the 1800s, what you get is sort of the opposite of what you have today. Today, firepower outweighs protection. It's very easy for a ship to be sunk by very little. In the 1800s, late 1800s, there are very few weapons. The torpedo and the mine are about the only 2 that can do it. that can sink a ship very quickly. And Tsushima really shows this. Torpedoes are good, the Russo-Japanese War shows that mines are good, and Tsushima shows that you need big, long-range guns. And so that's really what's happening there. It's not so much a romanticism thing. I mean, the Royal Navy, even up to the First World War, was planning to fight battles at ranges that were much closer than were actually fought during the war. They were planning to fight up to about 8,000 yards, but then this gets pushed out because they get pushed out to longer ranges because of the threat from German torpedoes. If you're firing at them from 8,000 yards, you're within range of their torpedoes, so you have to go further away to avoid their torpedoes. It's pretty much that.
With the introduction of these new styles of ships and I guess new ways to use technologies and new technologies themselves, does it then become you need to have these big ships to be taken seriously as a naval power? Or I guess it's kind of if dreadnoughts are really changing naval warfare at the time, is there kind of a dreadnought arms race in a sense to have the most dreadnoughts, to build the biggest ships, things like that?
There's a more general just dreadnought race throughout, which lasts from 1906 to the Washington Naval Treaty in 1921. But the most significant part of that is the British Anglo-German rivalry. And that gets driven by, on the German side, two people, Kaiser Wilhelm and Admiral Tirpitz. So Kaiser Wilhelm, he's driven by a desire to have a fleet that can match the Royal Navy because he was really impressed by the Royal Navy. He was grandson of Queen Victoria, spent a lot of time at Queen Victoria's house on the Isle of Wight, Osborne House, and there it's a 30-minute boat ride over to Portsmouth, Royal Navy's main base, and he would spend a lot of time there hanging out, being sort of fanboying over the Royal Navy, and just wants to have a sort of fleet so that he can sit on the bridge of his battleship and wave to his cousin George V as he goes past in his own battleship. And that's what he wants. While Tirpitz is more, he's the German Navy's man. He wants the biggest German Navy possible so that he can have a German Navy that he's proud of, and also partly just about power. He wants a big Navy, and he's going to get it any way possible. He comes up with a theory to sort of a post hoc justification, risk theory, which is, it's like the deterrence theories that are advanced in the Cold War. If we can build a fleet that's strong enough that the British can't defeat us without losing a large part of their fleet, then they won't want to fight us because they rely so much on their fleet. Except that building a fleet this big is basically an existential threat to Britain. The one thing Britain is scared of is a continental power with a navy big enough to take on the Royal Navy, because then Britain can never hope to build an army big enough to challenge the resources of a continental power, and so Britain can be invaded at will, and there we go, that's the end of the empire. So Britain has to be building a big navy in response to this. And it's not clear that the Germans really understand this. They're building the navy for their own reasons. And yes, it's in part aimed at Britain by Tirpitz's statements and so on, Tirpitz's risk theory, but it's not necessarily aimed at Britain, while the British see German naval expansion as a major threat, so have to build their fleet in response.
So were there people on, I guess you'd say either side, the German or the British side, who were kind of speaking out against this arms race? I mean, was there some thought about, well, let's cool this down, let's slow this down, because I know during the 80s and the 70s and the Cold War and things like that, there was a sense that if you build these bombs, someone's going to use them. So I mean, was there some thought to maybe slowing down or otherwise kind of moving away from a dreadnought arms race?
Yeah, there are attempts to throw them off there. So in 1912, Churchill, who is First Lord of the Admiralty, the sort of civilian head of the Royal Navy, offers the Germans a building holiday, a chance to pause their construction. And it's also, the German military budget as taken up in 1914. It's about 50% of this is going on the Navy, and the Army are not happy about this because they see themselves as more important. And so the Army is also opposed to the naval side. And they're not really very involved in the naval side either. They're having their own war plans that basically ignore the Navy completely. Same thing happens in Britain, though.
So it seems like there wasn't really kind of an effective, no dreadnoughts kind of campaign that would be equivalent to kind of the opposition to nuclear weapons in the Cold War. But, what was kind of the plan on using these dreadnoughts? Was it essentially like the use of nuclear, intercontinental ballistic missiles and such during the Cold War, where simply having them would deter the enemy from attacking you, or was this more like something that, again, if you build them, there's going to be an inevitable push to use them? Maybe what was the kind of tactical sense, or even I guess you could say the more strategic sense in building and using these dreadnoughts?
So the essential thing to understand here is the North Sea theatre. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens off in the rest of the world during the First World War in the naval sphere. You have fighting on the British side. There's colonial actions against the few German ships outside of Europe and South Africa and South America and to some extent in the Indian Ocean. But most of the stuff that happens in the First World War at sea happens in the North Sea. So this is basically a big square bounded on the west side by the UK, south side by Belgium and Netherlands and Germany. On the east, it's Denmark and Norway. So it's this nice box with three entrances. You have the English Channel, you have the Skagerrak, the straits leading into the Baltic, and you have the straits between Scotland and Norway. Now, what the British do on Declaration of War in 1914 is they say, we're going to stop anything getting into Germany. They set up a naval blockade along these entrances, only on the North Sea entrance and the English Channel entrance, because those are the ones they can easily police. And these are sitting hundreds of miles from the German coast, intercepting any ship that goes past, and because they're backed up by the might of the ground fleet, their battleship fleet, which is based in Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, can support blockade, can come out, and any time the Germans try and intervene with the blockade, they can come out and fight and win a battle against them. Well, the Germans, what they're trying to do is two things. They're trying to break the blockade. They're trying to go out and blow up the old cruisers and armed merchant ships that are making up this cordon around the North Sea. And they're also trying to stop the British getting into the Baltic. So Fisher has this great madcap scheme that if they can beat the German Navy, the High Seas Fleet, the Royal Navy is going to sail into the Baltic. They're going to go and pick up 1 million Russians, and they're going to land them on the coast of Pomerania, a few days' march from Berlin, and there we go, war's over. So the Germans have to stop the British doing that, and they've got to stop the British blockade. And so this is the big difference between nuclear weapons and dreadnoughts. A nuclear weapon, it gets used, then everything goes bye-bye. There's no real tactical case for using them. There's only very little strategic case for using them first. While with a dreadnought, you can achieve goals with them. You can break a blockade of your country. You can enable a war to be won by invading a hostile power. There's no real way to do that with a nuclear weapon. So while there are those similarities there is that deterrence. It's an analogy that breaks down when you get into the complexities of it. So what happens? Well, 1914, you get the first naval battle in the North Sea. Helgoland-Bight, which takes place in the sort of elbow that's formed by the German and Danish coasts. the British have noticed that this stretch of water is German territory. It's patrolled by the Germans, German destroyers, German cruisers. And British submarine officers there have noticed that the Germans have this precise routine for patrolling it, and some officers with the British force of light cruisers and destroyers based at Harwich in Essex are thinking, we could really exploit this. They get support from the battle cruisers that are with the Grand Fleet, and they go and raid the German forces in the Helig Iron Bight, come away sinking a few cruisers and a destroyer, and this is a big success, but it's not really anything amazing. Then the Germans come along, and they're trying to draw out a small portion of the Grand Fleet, small enough that they can defeat it in a single action, and then that will weaken the Grand Fleet such that they can destroy it in a proper fleet action. So they're trying to find ways to do this.
So we have kind of two opposing cat and mouse strategies in a way, where the British are trying to lure out essentially all of the German high seas fleet to concisely destroy it, while the high seas fleet of the Germans is trying to lure out just enough of the Royal Navy to kind of cripple it.
Pretty much, yeah. The Royal Navy, they want to fight a battle they can win. The German Navy also wants to fight a battle it can win. Those two look very different, though. So the Germans in 1914, early 1915, make two raids on the British coast. They make a raid on the coast of East Anglia, Yarmouth, which doesn't really go that well. They don't really do that much, and they fail to draw out the Royal Navy because the Royal Navy had no clue what was happening. Then they hit the Yorkshire coast at Scarborough, Whitby, and Hartlepool. And here, the Royal Navy does respond. They send down the battle cruisers again, and they send down a squadron of dreadnoughts. And here, there is actually some fighting between the two sides. There's a lot of mist, a lot of rain, a lot of fog. The Royal Navy's scouting cruisers run into the Germans, and then there's a lot of blundering around. The Royal Navy nearly runs into the high seas fleet, but doesn't. The German battle cruisers nearly run into the British battle cruisers and battleships, but don't. And this is a thing that we'll probably be discussing later. Some British ships do sight the Germans and could have forced an action, but it doesn't really get communicated up the chain of command, and so nothing happens. But then, next big battle in the North Sea is Dogger Bank in early 1915. And this is driven by the Germans worrying about how are the British getting information about what their operations are. The British are actually reading their radio signals, but they think it's probably the trawlers on the Dogger Bank that are not Japanese gunboats, as the Russians found. So the German battle cruisers under Hipper sail out to go and check if any of these trawlers on the Dogger Bank are spy ships. British battle cruisers, in turn, under Beatty, come out, and there's this short, sharp, inconclusive action where the Royal Navy engage the Germans. They batter the German battle cruisers. Beatty's flagship, HMS Lion, also gets battered. The Germans lose one ship because the British, there's a massive miscommunication. Someone on Lion thinks they've spotted a submarine. So if they think they've spotted a submarine periscope, they haven't actually. It's just a wake or a dolphin or something like that. The British line gets told, turn massively, avoid this, and then get told to attack the German rear, which everyone in the battle cruiser squadron interprets as being beat up on this one ship that's straggling behind massively rather than trying to chase. And so the Germans lose just one ship, and it's an older ship. It's called the Blucher. It's a weird hybrid design. It's sort of a dreadnought armoured cruiser. It's like a light battle cruiser. And so Dogger Bank is then the end of battles in the North Sea until Jutland. Oh no, not quite. There's a raid on Lowestoft in April 1916. Well, so now the reason there's this big break in offensive operations is that the Germans have had a change in commander. They started off with a guy called Ingernoll, who then got promoted up to the German naval staff. He was replaced by von Pohl, who was a very cautious sort of chap, didn't want to risk losing the fleet. But then von Pohl gets cancer and is forced to retire through health, and he gets replaced with Admiral Scheer, who is in command at Jutland. And Scheer is very aggressive. He wants to do something. He wants to make sure that the German fleet doesn't wither away, lose morale, is actually out there doing offensive operations and trying to win the war. And so, 1916, it's May 1916, he's planning an operation, again, another raid on the British coast. And so he sends out his submarines to go and form a scouting line along the routes that the ground fleet is going to have to take to come south to meet him. But then the weather intervenes, and it's not very good weather over near Britain at the time the operation's planned for. And so he has to work out, is he going to let his submarines come home without doing anything, or is he going to sail out and try and do something and take advantage of those submarines being there? And he leaves it pretty late, so they're meant to be coming back on the 1st to the 2nd of June. He sails out on the 31st to go and check for British merchant ships in the Skagerrak, in the strait between Jutland and Norway. And so that's what he wants to do. The British also have a plan to go and raid the Heligoland Bight again. They're getting ready to send their own submarines out there, and they've also got a mine layer ready to dash in, lay some mines on the routes the Germans are going to take, and then dash out again. Of these, the destroyer actually manages to do that, but they're getting ready to sail out and do their own thing as well, in roughly the same area.
Now, to what extent does either side know that the other side is preparing something big? I mean, of course, there's that general idea in war footing that, the enemy is out there, but it seems like at the same time, both sides prepping for, a major naval offensive. Is the other side aware that they're both doing this? I mean, what, or are they just kind of blundering towards each other, or do they really know that something big is coming?
So they've got ideas that they're doing this, the British in particular. So the British have a very well established signals intelligence community. It's called by the name of the room they occupied at the Admiralty, Room 40. And Room 40 is picking up all the German messages that are being sent, and they are collating them, and they're analysing them, and they're breaking the codes they're in and reading them. And so they're able to say, there's probably something big happening. They do actually know what's happening, except that the guy whose job it is to take the messages from Room 40 to the rest of the Admiralty and pass them on to the fleet is not on very good terms with the codebreakers in Room 40. And so he goes in and asks, where is this code sign used by Scheer? And he gets told it's in the German naval base on the Jade Estuary. Except that this is completely the wrong question to be asking, because that call sign never leaves that place. It's a call sign used by Scheer when he's in harbour. Room 40 knows that Scheer has sailed, but the guy who's passing it on hasn't asked this question. He's just asked, where is Scheer's harbour code sign? The answer is in harbour. And because Room 40 don't like the guy very much, they don't volunteer the information that, it's in harbour, but we think she has sailed. So Jellicoe and Beatty are expecting to run into some sort of German opposition when they're sailing out to meet the Germans, but they don't know that it's the entire High Seas Fleet and the battle cruisers. They just think it's probably going to be the battle cruisers or some cruisers or something like that.
Now, we've been throwing a lot of names out here a lot, so if we could kind of maybe take a moment to kind of pause and just kind of unpack who some of the players are here. So on the British side, it seems like we've been mentioning people like Beatty and like Jellicoe, and I know that there's a bit of a historical debate over their roles in Jutland. But could you maybe just kind of unpack a little who these people were and what their roles were in the Royal Navy?
So, yes, Jellicoe and Beatty are the two sort of Wunderkinds of the British Admiralty. Jellicoe is the commander of the Grand Fleet. He is sort of very meticulous, very popular, very careful, cautious guy. He is very talented. He's Fisher's protege in many ways. So Fisher makes a prediction in the early 1900s that the war is probably going to come in 1914, because that's when the Germans finish the Kiel Canal linking the Baltic to the North Sea, and so they can fight Russia and Britain at sea very easily. And so he's thinking they'll probably try and do something then. And he says, when the day of Armageddon comes, when this major naval battle happens, I want Jellicoe in charge. Beatty, on the other hand, is a sort of hot-headed, he's hot-headed, he's ambitious. He's in charge of the battlecruisers. The battlecruisers are based, rather than being up at Scapa Flow with the rest of the fleet, they're based down at Rosyth, near Edinburgh, because all the German raids on the British coast have made them jumpy. They're trying to at least have some of the fleet there that can come out as a response. Beatty, where Jellicoe is careful and meticulous, Beatty is carefree and very sort of go at it. So Jellicoe prepares meticulous, very detailed, very lengthy fighting instructions. Beatty doesn't. Beatty's force has got added to it the new fast super dreadnoughts of the 5th Battle Squadron. These are the most powerful ships in the world, in many ways. They're brand new, got bigger guns than any other ship in the world, pretty much. And they're there because one of Beatty's 3 battlecruiser squadrons has had to go up to Scapa Flow for gunnery practice. There's no safe place at Rosyth on the 1st of 4th for the British ships to do gunnery practice, while at Scapa Flow, which is in the Orkneys, very empty, there's plenty of places for them to fire off shells with wild abandon. So the battlecruisers are terrible shots. This has been noticed. He's had to send one of his battlecruiser squadrons up north and has asked for this 5th Battle Squadron to come down south to reinforce him instead. So he gets this in about April 1916. And then, until Jutland, never really goes and talks to the commander of the 5th Battle Squadron about what he's going to do. What, in the case of action, is 5th Battle going to do? And so this tells us Jellicoe has written his nice battle orders. They're up on the British Library website if you want to go and read them. He's got these meticulous battle orders that say, this is what the Battle Squadron is going to do in event of action, this is what they're going to do in case of a night action, this is what they're going to do if we run into a force of German Zeppelins, whatever. Well, the 5th Battle Squadron is just like, I guess we're going to go and fight the Germans? And I think that's, the difference in their command styles.
So it sounds like Beatty's plan for 5th Battle Group was more of kind of an improvisational approach.
Pretty much, yeah. And so this does account for many... So, spoiler alert, the Battlecruiser Squadron is going to run into a lot of difficulty, and that's mostly down to Beatty's failure to actually think about how he's going to fight a battle and what his commanders are going to do.
So we've got these two very different men on the British side, and I want to maybe get around to the German side as well. But to kind of get things moving towards the battle here, I mean, how do the initial deployments into the North Sea kind of start playing out? Because we have these fleets kind of steaming over from the Scapa Flow, and I assume we have the German fleets as well coming up from their bases as well. I mean, how do the initial deployments work out?
So the deployments are sort of, what's happened is Jellicoe has taken the Grand Fleet down from the north. Beatty has taken the battlecruiser fleet across the North Sea, and they're going to get to the German coast, steer northwards to meet up with Jellicoe at a rendezvous point. Meanwhile, Scheer has detached his battlecruisers under Hipper to go and steam northwards as a fast squadron to scout ahead and to find anything suspicious in the Skagerrak. And so Beatty and Hipper are seeming on roughly parallel courses northwards, and then suddenly a commander in BT's scouting screen spots some smoke on the horizon, as do the crew of Hippers. They go off and investigate, and it turns out that this smoke is coming from a Danish merchant ship. The British ship gets there to find there's a couple of German destroyers checking this ship out, and this is when battle is joined. There's also, interesting, one of the first uses of aviation going on in a naval battle. So the British fleet has got a couple of seaplane carriers with it. The battlecruiser squadron has a HMS Engadine, and the Grand Fleet has HMS Companion, or at least it's supposed to. The captain of Companion missed the signal telling him to sail, and so is sitting in Scapa Flow, is steaming south from Scapa Flow, but is about 10 hours late. While Engadine has hoisted out one of her aircraft, the pilot takes it up, goes off and sees some German ships, but then finds out his radio is broken. So he has to go and land next to a British ship, try and get to use their radio, and so this information doesn't get to anyone in charge until well after the battle has begun. But it is quite interesting as pretty much the first use of aviation in an actual fleet battle.
Now, you had mentioned the use of radio for the seaplane, the scouting plane, and particularly kind of a jam radio. And I think, if anything, in my research in the Battle of Jutland, problems with communication seem pretty key to how the battle actually played out. So could you give us an idea about what the practice of communication between ships and, amongst fleets were at the time of this battle? Were they all using radio? Were they still using signal flags? I mean, how were ships communicating to each other and relaying information to and from each other?
So communicating between two separated fleets was almost universally done by radio, except there are problems with this, particularly on the British side. So the British are using what are called spark gap radios, the original sort of ones Marconi invented. Except that these have big problems. They're not nice, neat, simple, so their frequency spectrum are not nice, simple, sharp cutoffs. They're noisy. They produce a lot of noise. And so when you've got more than one ship trying to communicate at once, what they end up doing is just end up jamming each other, and then no one can talk at all. And so this does happen quite a bit on the Royal Navy side. The Royal Navy is also really, really worried about the possibility of the Germans listening into them or homing in on their radio communications, because they're doing it to the Germans. So they're going, we're listening to everything the Germans are saying, we're decoding these. Are they doing it to us? We can't risk not taking precautions about that, so let's try and cut our radio usage. For local signaling, in particular, they're using signal flags and searchlights, Morse code searchlights. And so these have, particularly signal flags, have a big advantage over radio. Because with radio, using Morse code, it takes a long time to send a message. Signal flags, you have a nice little signal book that says, if you hoist flags A, C, and 3, then that means there are 3 German battleships bearing that way, or whatever. And so you can hoist these signals, and they're really quick and easy to read, and that means communication with flag signals isn't really outdated until the introduction in the 30s of nice close-range voice radios. But yes, for fleet-to-fleet signaling, the British are using radio. The Germans are also using radio. Their ones are slightly fancier. They don't do as much self-jamming, and they're very talkative with it. The British pick up a lot of German messages during this battle. Because of their problems with the British radios, very few of these actually make it to Jellicoe, who could have used them a lot. But yes, the Germans talkative on radio. And that's a downside.
So I think we're doing quite a lot of kind of background information here, which I think is going to help us understand the battle and what comes after it. But I mean, let's actually get into the battle here. Let's talk about the meat of it, and then we can kind of move on and talk about the consequences of it. So I mean, how does this battle actually start? I mean, we've had these kind of initial maneuvers, but when it really gets into its an actual combat phase, I mean, how does that play out? Because I know there's like some complicated maneuvers that go on during it.
So Jutland can be really divided into 4 phases. The first one of these is called the Run to the South. So BT and Hipper, their battle cruiser fleets, run into each other, and they start fighting each other. And the Germans are like, we're in a fight, there's far more of them, they have battleships, let's run back to the High Seas Fleet. So they start running southwards, while with BT following a parallel course. And during this run to the south, 2 British battle cruisers explode. Indefatigable and Queen Mary. They both have magazine explosions in a relatively short space of time, and they sink. And then the run to the south ends when BT's scouting ships, a cruiser squadron under an admiral called Goodenough, find the High Seas Fleet. And then BT, a few minutes later, actually encounters them. And so he turns northwards. Except 5th Battle Squadron don't quite get the message to go northwards until too late. They get much too close to the German fleet. They turn around, they take a bit of a battering as they do so, and now it's the run to the north as BT runs away from Scheer to Jellicoe. And during this, Jellicoe is receiving garbled messages. The Grand Fleet receives a radio message. It's not received by Jellicoe, it's received by another ship in the Grand Fleet, and then passed to Jellicoe's flagship. And it tells Jellicoe that sort of the Germans have bought every single ship they possibly can, including some of the ones that everyone thought were under construction or cancelled, and couldn't possibly make it to a battle. And so he's like, what is going on? And that's about the only useful piece of information he gets about the engagement that BT's having. So he's got to work out how he's going to deploy the Grand Fleet. He's got to work out, because the Grand Fleet is steaming in a sort of formation that's nice and simple to protect against submarine attack. It's a whole bunch of battleships engaged, steaming in lines. So each squadron is steaming in a line astern, but they're all parallel to each other. He's got to work out how he's going to deploy those into the line of battle that everyone uses. Which is just one big long line astern with all the battle squadrons in that. While he's puzzling out what he's going to do there, the Germans run into Jellicoe's screen, which is the 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron that I mentioned earlier on, the one that got sent up north to the Grand Fleet. And here the British lose another battle cruiser, the rather aptly named Invincible, again to a magazine explosion. So BT runs north, and then Scheer encounters the Grand Fleet. Jellicoe has decided which direction he's going to deploy into. He can deploy port or starboard. He chooses to deploy starboard. And this is a fortuitous decision based on a whole lot of guesswork, really. He doesn't know it. Because deploying to starboard means that he's doing what's called crossing the Germans' T. He's going across the top of their line. And so all his ships can fire at the front of the German line, while the Germans can't. Only the ship at the front can fire at his line. And this is pretty much the perfect situation for an admiral in the Dreadnought period. But then Scheer does what's called a battle about turn in the Germans. There's a long, complicated German compound noun here that I'm not going to try and pronounce. So this is basically German response to getting their T crossed. It's turn every single ship around 180 degrees as fast as possible and get out of there. So he does that, runs away, but then for some kind of some reason that is unknown to us, known only to Scheer, decides he's going to come around for another go. And this goes in much the same way. He's coming along straight into the British lines, getting fired upon, turns around, decides to go back, and deploys his battle cruisers, his destroyers, to screen his retreat. And this as one of the decisive moments of the battle, the Germans make their torpedo attack, and Jellicoe decides that he's going to, rather than turn his ships towards the torpedoes to try and chase Scheer, he's going to turn away. Turning away means his ships are much less likely to get hit by torpedoes, but he's going to lose the chance to follow up the engagement. Turning towards the torpedoes, more chance of being hit, but he can catch Scheer before nightfall. So then that forces an end to the battle until night. But then Scheer decides what he's going to do is sort of run, and after nightfall he's going to run round and back round the British line and try and make it back to Germany that way. And he does this to some extent. He manages to, despite a lot of close calls, run through the British line, run past the British line, and make it back. Along the way, he's attacked by a whole lot of British destroyers. The British have sent their destroyers out to try and interdict him, try and work out where he's going so that Jellicoe can sort of get into a position to smash him at daybreak. And so here the Germans lose one of their old pre-dreadnought battleships. So they've got 2 squadrons of dreadnought battleships, and then they brought along what's called the 5-minute squadron, which is 8 of their most modern pre-dreadnoughts, just to sort of try and bulk the line out. One of these, the Pommern, gets hit by a British torpedo, and its magazines go up and it sinks. They've also lost one of their battlecruisers, the Lutzow, which was heavily shelled and then had to be scuttled because it was just going to sink if they didn't. So they managed to make it back. They managed to lose the British in the night, despite this long destroy action, which is very sort of confused. There's all sorts of ships running into each other, not knowing which side is which until the firing starts. There's a case where a German ship rams a British destroyer accidentally. There's a case where 2 British destroyers run into each other. It's all a bit of mayhem, and then the Germans managed to make it back into the safety of the German coast and have lost Jellicoe. And so when the time comes to sort of tot up the losses, the British have come out probably the worst. They've lost 3 of their battle cruisers, 3 of the older armoured cruisers. The Germans have lost 1 nice new fancy battle cruiser and 1 old destroyer. They've also had heavy damage to 2 of their other battle cruisers, Seydlitz and Derfflinger. Seydlitz is so heavily flooded that when she gets back to harbour, she can't actually clear the sandbank she's taken on so much water that she's being held afloat by just 1 compartment in her bow section. So the Germans have come off a lot better. They've killed a lot more British sailors, but they've had their confidence knocked, and they've had a lot more serious damage done to their ships. So the British are back in action. Pretty much every ship is back in action by the end of August. The Germans, it takes a lot longer, and they've also had serious damage done to their confidence and morale. They no longer feel that they can really draw out the British, just a part of the British fleet. They've tried to do it, and they've just been met with an overwhelming force. And now, while they do try and sortie again after Jutland, they never really try and seek action. They never try and fight. And so, Jutland is often thought of as this tactical victory by the Germans, but a strategic victory for the British, because it stops the Germans trying to do anything else in the North Sea.
And that, unfortunately, is where we're going to end today. We're going to be back in 2 weeks with part 2 of this episode, where we're going to cover kind of the latter part of the battle and the fallout from it, and kind of examine more of the historiography of the battle, because there's kind of this long-standing debate over, well, who was responsible for not making this the most decisive battle in naval history, as everyone was hoping and kind of expecting it would be, instead of kind of being this, large, significant battle, but that didn't there was no knockout punch, unfortunately. So we're going to be back in 2 weeks for that. We're also going to do our book giveaway on that episode then. And we're also going to have a great run of shows coming up after that. We're going to have some speeches from the National Council of Public History. Anyway, some discussions about public history, some of the talks from that. And we're going to be interviewing, I know I just recorded an episode with Professor Mike Nichols, who does the Virtual Rome Project and has a massive online course coming out. So we have some great episodes coming for you in the next few weeks, next few episodes coming up. So I hope you'll come back and join us for that. And of course, I hope you'll come back in 2 weeks and join us for the conclusion of the Jutland episode here. In the meantime, you can check us out on iTunes and Google Play and wherever you get your podcasts. And rate and review us. Apparently that does, of course, some sort of black magic to let other people know that this is a podcast worth listening to, which clearly you think it is because you've made it this far. So thank you, and thank you for listening. And a big thanks, of course, to all our Patreon subscribers as well. If you want to join in to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/AskHistorians. All right, that's going to conclude it for this show. So we'll see you in 2 weeks for the conclusion of the Battle of Jutland and the historiographical debate over the significance of the battle and the actions of those involved. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.